Hi everyone, this is introductory video for our module in African philosophy on ethics, specifically on gender and sexuality and identity in African philosophy. And so this won't be too long. Most of what I want to say is in the module itself. You probably have more videos to watch this time around than you often do. Let me just jump into what we have this time around. This time there's an interview with Louise du Toit, who is a philosopher at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. I think it's a great conversation. We talk a lot about the place of gender in Africa, the place of gender in the history of colonialism, how it relates to race, gender identity, sexual identity. We have a number of things we talk about, and I think she really clarifies some things very well for us, and so that's well worth watching. As you can see in the module here, I've got some other videos. I want to pick up the question or the idea of intersectionality. This is an idea that really develops in the US originally with people like Kimberly Crenshaw and others, and really what it tries to get at is the issue of multiple identities that are not simply additive. In other words, when somebody is African, is black, is a woman, is perhaps queer in some way, is disabled. I mean, there are any number of things that may or may not come together. If you're in other places, if say you're in India and somebody is Dalit, which is a caste that's considered the lowest of the low, there are many ways that these identities come together and produce very, in some cases, unexpected outcomes. Sometimes they're what I would think of as multiplicative rather than additive. In other words, it's not just that you are marginalized because you're a woman and because you're black, but sometimes those two come together to have an extra kind of challenge to them. And so, some of these things are explored in some of these videos here. Most of them are fairly short. In this section at least. And so I want you to think about this, because when we're thinking about African philosophy, as you already know, as you've already seen when we've talked about race, it doesn't necessarily work the same way on the continent as it does elsewhere, certainly not in the US. We have tended to think about race in very often binary sorts of ways in the US. We've had more than one person that I've interviewed already in this course say I didn't really think of myself as black until I left the continent, until I came to the US or until I came to the UK or something like that, and then they had a sense of what that meant. And there are a number of reasons for why that might be. I mean, for one, if you were in a country that has the vast majority of people looking like you, that might just be considered to be normal. Having said that, that does not necessarily mean that if you have a country that's half or more women, that's going to be considered, natural and normal. In other words, not stratified in some way. It could easily still be stratified, still be marginalized as a status. And so, we've talked about race already, and some of the ways that it works out in Africa. Certainly within South Africa, race has been an extremely important thing, in part because of how apartheid worked. And of course, across Africa, it's been important, for hundreds of years because of the slave trade and the logic of how people were taken out of Africa and the reasons for that. And so, if we think about other forms of identity as coloring, adding to, making worse somebody's lived experience in a place, we have to go beyond just talking about race. Often when people think about Africa, the first thing they think about is race. And the irony of that is that, as I've said, that's not necessarily the first thing that people who live there think about. and there are many other things under consideration. So I think Louise Dutoit does a really lovely job, a really powerful job of talking about the ways in which gender is intertwined with race when it comes to issues of colonialism, and I think is very clarifying on that. So I also want to talk about I want to talk about homosexuality. I want to talk about status of gays and lesbians in various places in Africa. There are some fairly well-known cases in which laws have been put in place in some countries, notably places like Uganda, that have banned and punished homosexuality, sometimes quite severely. And there's quite a lot of discussion about where those laws came from. Many people want to depict them as part of traditional Africa. Many others will point out that there's all sorts of gender fluidity in traditional Africa, in all sorts of different cultures across the continent. And many of these very draconian and harsh laws really look much more like what we would have in the US or in other Western countries that have determined that homosexuality is something like a pathology or something like a illness or something like that. So, the disputes over how it should be regarded within traditional African culture are there are live discussions. I think the evidence does show that that there has been gender fluidity in all sorts of different ways within traditional cultures in Africa, and so that's a really interesting thing to look at as well. To think about, how does this how is this relevant to philosophy, right? I mean, is this just sociology? Is this gender studies? I think it is relevant to philosophy because it really is about who we are as humans, what our identities are, and so I think I think it's important to think about the ways in which concepts are used in different places, and to think about how they might be used similarly to what you're familiar with, and how they might be used differently to what you're familiar with. Finally, I've got some more videos here which talk about gender. I've got a longish interview with Nkira Nzegu, who we also have a History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps interview with. I'm not asking that you necessarily watch the whole video. It's almost 2 hours long. You can dip into it and catch a little bit of it, but the other ones are shorter, and I think they get at some of these kinds of questions that we're trying to raise. And so I've put this under the general heading of ethics. It could just as well in some ways be put under the general heading of metaphysics or epistemology or any number of other things, but it really often manifests itself as questions of ethics. How do we live ethically in a society? How do we give proper standing, proper moral standing, and to whom do we give that? What does moral agency look like? Some of these questions that we brought up last week when we were just thinking about ethics more directly. So that's the game for this week. It's lots of really interesting material, and as always, I look forward to your comments and discussion in the discussion area. So I will see you over there.